fashion. Alright, so we're going to be doing these welt pockets here, and as you know, I don't like to fuse directly on the garment because that's eventually going to end up bubbling. So I'm using this, what is it called now? A canvas. Sometimes I'll use horsehair, sometimes I'll just use a piece of thick silicea. It kind of depends on how thick this underlayer is, or this like actual garment. So it's just a piece of canvas, and then I put some fusing on it so that the side that's now going to touch the actual pocket is smooth. It's not that rough um, canvas. So that's how it's lying on there. And now I need to attach it to my pocket. Is now this contrasting color just for funsies. So let's do this one. And you see here on the pocket piece, I've drawn up like 3/4 centimeters, just a line there. And now my the angle that this pocket is on is 1 centimeter. So whatever your angle is on, you're going to draw that, and that's where my pocket is now going to lie. And of course, there has to be a mirror image because this is not on the front, and you want the fusing side to be on the front there. And this is now basically exactly the same as when we do a collar or a cuff. We're just going to baste it in place while we're working. No knots, so I'm just going to go 3 times in one place. And I'm going to go straight down the bottom edge. So of course, if you wanted to skip this step, you would just fuse the shape, the final shape of your pocket. You would just fuse directly onto the fabric that you wanted. The only difference there, if you're going to fuse, is that you would here, I mean up to you, but I would here include an extra 1/2 centimeter seam allowance on the fusing so that you're going to stitch through that fuse section. So here on this end, I'm actually just going to go once and then pass it through to the right side. Try not to get too many knots. And then here again, same as for the collar and cuffs, we're wanting to stitch from the right side, and as we go, just kind of smooth it out over the shape that we have so that we don't end up with any bubbles. You don't want to smooth too much so that it ends up bubbling like that, but you don't want to accidentally include some too much excess in there. So far, that's just what I'm going to do. Stitching along. So of course, this is the time-consuming part of this job, but my therapist has made way too much money off of the drama that is caused by that fusing bubbling up and not looking fabulous, and then you have to redo that pocket just because the fusing has bubbled. Okay, so once that's there, the next thing we're going to do is find my ruler and then trim off this excess. Obviously, you could have shaped this up beforehand. I'm just a cowboy, so I cut things more square and then shape them later. So now I'm putting 1/2 centimeter from the shape of my pocket piece to the edge where I'm cutting. Just going to cut that off. And now here I'm going to flip this like so. And then stitch along these edges. Now, of course, here, it's because it's a square that's now being twisted, this doesn't match. And obviously, I could have cut that correctly, but I didn't because I don't feel like it. And also what you can do if you want, so this welt is going to have the same fabric front and back, and then the pocket's going to be on the inside. But if you want it to be fancy and also if it's a thick fabric, then you can have the lining starting maybe over here. So if you wanted to do that, then you would just cut this maybe 1.5 centimeters and then attach your lining from there. but I'm not going to do that because this is quite thin. So I'm just going to flip it up in line with the shape of the pocket and then stitch here. And I'm not going to stitch all the way, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stitch there and there. So I think let me do that, and then, so yeah, I'm trying to stitch this. Okay, this one now has a few holes in it. But it's just not wanting to play with me. Look at that, didn't stitch a single one. And you'll often find this if you have like a difference in thickness between here and here where you're stitching. So what I'm going to do is just take one of the other ones and put it next door so that the foot of the machine is flat. So it's not like, struggling with one side thicker than the other. Oh, even there we're struggling a little bit. But there we go. So there it's stitched as good as it's going to do. So if that happens, it's usually because you need like a flat thing to stitch on. It's just coming off to the side. The domestic machine usually won't have that much drama, but sometimes the industrials. I think that's totally chill. Awesome. So then I just stitched over there and I didn't go past the shape of my pocket. So that piece is still open. Here I'm going to trim that down. If it's a thick fabric, you can do that with a zigzag. And then I'm just going to flip that around. So here I'm going to fold that corner and flip it. And then with my needle, just flip that around. Here on the pointing side, I'm just going to trim that down a little bit further. And then again, fold it and flip it. And just like that. So I'm going to iron this on the back, ironing it like onto the shape of my pocket piece. And then if you had your lining here, then you would need to be ironing this backwards so that the lining isn't going to stick out, on that side of your pocket, of course. But now, because it's the same, I'm just making these like even, those edges. And obviously I'm going to do that with all the pockets. And then the last thing I'm going to do is just trim this down. Here I'm just kind of measuring with my eyes because I just want a straight piece here. So this is going to be maybe, I don't know, centimeter and a quarter past where my pocket piece is. This is on the back. So this depends. If your piece was bigger, you could actually have this piece going all the way down and that can become your pocket. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, I just want it to be flat. And like I said, of course, I could have cut the pattern piece better, but I didn't because I didn't feel like it. So that's how it goes. But yeah, I'm going to do that to all of them, and then we'll pop over to the waistcoat and start stitching that on. Shop, shop. Okay, so we turned that around, trimmed off the edge there. If you've done a longer piece, then this is going to become part of your pocket bag. So then you don't have to trim it, but because I'm doing a separate pocket bag, I trimmed there. And we do need some way to connect the canvas piece, that stiff piece, to the fabric. Otherwise it's going to float around and that's not really going to work. So I'm going to do that with a hand stitch. I suppose you could do it by machine. And it's going to be a decorative stitch just here on the top edge of the pocket. Usually I would draw a line there just to guide myself. But this fabric has a bit of polyester in, so that black pen that we usually use, the friction pen, is going to leave a white mark. And I don't feel like erasing chalk afterwards, so I'm just going to measure with my eyes 1/2 centimeter. And just stitch along the top here, doing this decorative prick stitch. Some people call it pick stitch. I don't really think there's an exact term. If obviously you had just fused, then you wouldn't have to do this. And if you don't want to see the prick stitching there, if you have one of those insane clients who doesn't like prick stitching, then I would, or I have in the past, stitched from the back side, and then you don't see it here on the front. Because you have to, in some way, connect these two. So when we do this on a collar or a cuff, that's why we do the top stitch around the edges, so we can connect um, those two together, all of those layers together. So I'm almost done here, and then we'll do the next thing. Nothing too exciting, just stitching, being as neat as possible and as straight as possible. Very difficult for me, but I try. Of course, yeah, you see, very tough. Oh my gosh. Anyway. Yeah, so I suppose you could also do this down the side if you really wanted to. I'm not going to, because on the sides I'm going to do a stitch, a machine stitch to catch it onto the fabric, onto the garment. So, alright. So let me just knot off over here. Oh. Now this needle, it has like almost like a sharp eye in a way. So after you've worked with the thread a little bit, it in a way cuts the thread. And after you've worked with the needle for a little bit, it kind of wears down that sharpness. You know, sometimes the thread is just going to cut in the middle of your attempt at fame. How embarrassing. Oh, question, what's going on there? Okay. So, stitch that down, knot that off. And then from there, we're going to just attach this onto the garment. I'm going to just put something at the back here so that can lie flat while I'm working on it. Now it's going to sit like that at the end of the day. This line is now the bottom of my pocket. So I'm going to stitch it from this side, and I want the line that I'm stitching to match up with this line that I've chalked on the garment. I don't know if it's really a crime to just stitch straight over there. I've never done it. I've never been that brave. So I'm going to shift that out of the way and stitch from the corner along this edge. And of course, if you had fused this, then you would have had a half a centimeter extra, and you'd be stitching through the fusing. And in that case, it's actually better to just mark that line before you carry on making the pocket, just so that you have a straight line here to stitch on. But okay, well, that's good. So let's pop over to the sewing machine. Sewing machine time. Right from in there. Like I said, I don't know if it's a crime to stitch over that. I haven't ever. I'm going to stitch from in there. Let me just quickly see who's messaging me. Okay. Stitching right up to that corner and just along the edge there. Nothing too exciting. It is a bit fiddly, but you just have to kind of bend this garment as you go so that you can get right to that corner. Okay. And then from there, so I have to trim as I go. You see, this came through to that cotton. So we didn't stitch straight to the horsehair because that would have been quite thick, those seam allowances. So now I'm going to take my pocket bag, the one piece that I have. You see my pocket, it's going in that direction with this being 1 centimeter higher. my pocket bag is exactly the same. And I'm going to put my pocket bag kind of just touching there. And I've cut this, the same width as I did the pocket itself, because I need that seam allowance. Of course, for the pocket, that seam allowance is not finished in there. So here, you want to stitch maybe a centimeter, centimeter and a half inside of where this pocket is. So maybe sort of here to here. I don't really measure it. I just measure it with my eyes. And then I'm just going to stitch that with the machine foot. And that should give us, between those two stitch lines, about a centimeter. And okay, now this color is a bit tough to see, but you can see it's about a centimeter parallel. And then the bottom one, it's about a centimeter and a half wider than the top one. So I'm going to do that for all the pockets, and then we're going to carry on from there. All right, so we've done all of that sewing. Now this one I'm going to do here, it is extra. I can admit that of myself, but I'm wanting to sew this seam allowance just up onto that stiff part, onto that shape that we have of the pocket. And something that I did forget is that you can, while you're making this, before you turn it around, right way around, once you've sewn those side edges, you can actually cut the seam allowance right into there where you've stitched, and then it will leave a little corner out like that. I'll only do that if the fabric is very thick and I don't want all the seam allowance to be tucked in under there. Usually I don't do it, which is why I just completely forgot to mention that. So yeah, I'm just keeping my left hand underneath this pocket flap thing, underneath this welt pocket, so that I don't end up accidentally stitching through to the right side. Again, this is really just because we're not doing the fusing. So we have to have some method of fixing that stiff portion, oh gosh, to the fabric. Whereas obviously if you just fused, then you wouldn't be going through, oh, look at all of this drama I have to go through just because I don't fuse. So yeah, there's nothing really too exciting about that. I'm just going to do this whip stitch all the way, just fixing the shape of the pocket onto the seam allowance, and just going and going. Keeping my left hand there underneath so that I don't accidentally stitch through to the right side. Yeah, and in this corner, if you have notched that, then obviously the corner will be out of the way. Oh, you see, I actually stitched that by accident. But here you can just kind of fold it in. And because the stiffness of this canvas is quite thick, if it's a bit chunky there at the back, no one's going to die. It's not going to shine through. Whereas if you just had a thin fusing there, the seam allowance could get a little bit too thick. So there I would actually suggest notching that seam allowance so that it doesn't get included into the pocket here. Okay, I'm just going to stitch 3 times in one place to finish that off. So it doesn't have to be all that secure as long as it's more or less done. Okay, and then we're going to travel to the iron.
Okay.
All right, so obviously I'm just going to iron that. And now this pocket portion, or pocket bag portion, I'm going to iron down on that seam, and that straightness I'm going to go all the way so that I have a nice sharp edge there beyond the stitching. So you see the stitching ends there, but I'm just continuing that fold Yeah, does it really matter? I don't know. Makes me feel better. And I feel like it's going to help me in a minute to get a nice, sharp, clean pocket. Okay, so that's there. Now, if you haven't stitched this, obviously you'll need to iron this seam allowance up into the pocket. But you know, this one's stitched, so I just gave it a nice iron. Sorted. So now I'm going to make sure all of my layers are out of the way. I'm going to move here to the back. I'm going to cut through first just this back piece of cotton. Is that it? Yeah. And this one I'm going to cut maybe like a mole past my stitch line and then right into the corner of the stitching, both sides. So in this one I'm just going to cut kind of straight up like that. Also here, a little bit past, and then straight up to the stitching. So I'll start by getting this out of the way. And a small thing like this is really where ironing on the board can help you, because it will help you to get a nice sharp edge with a small thing like this. Fortunately, cotton, it's easy to fold. If you're working on a polyester or a wool, it's going to fight you. Yeah, so this little excess there I can just trim away. Same here. Okay. And then again, making sure that my pocket pieces are out of the way. I'm going to cut through my garment. And this time I'm going to stop maybe on the bottom, you know, maybe like 2 centimeters back from the edge of the stitching there. And I'm going to stitch this actually in a curve around there. I'm not going to do a straight miter, because a straight miter, the seam allowance here on this edge ends up being very, very small. And then it can fray out of there. I'm going to go in a bit of a curve. And I don't go all the way to the stitch line or to that stitch point. I stop maybe 1 mil, 2 mils before that, and then I let the fray go all the way to the stitch line. Same story this side. I'm just going to go in the middle, making sure I don't cut my pocket bags or pocket pieces in any way. This one I'm going to kind of curve down to the stitch, stopping like 1 mil. Keep that out the way. And this one, also just stitching or cutting into that curve and stopping like 1 mil before. Then before I carry on, here I'm going to pull this little triangle and just iron that as flat as I can backwards. Same with this one. I accidentally cut my pocket there. No. If you have accidentally cut the pocket, you know, depending on how much of a drama it is, sometimes you can just patch it. Sometimes it doesn't actually matter at all. Okay, so you see there's my 2 triangles. I've just got them out the way. Coming back here, and now this portion that I ironed straight there, I'm just going to re-iron it because it likes to move around. I'm going to push that through that hole. And then these straight portions are going to pop out that side. And then here, you know, this portion here, this little trapezoid shape, you don't really have to do anything. You can actually leave it exactly like that. Or you can just machine along the edges to give it like some security. And obviously, you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to hand stitch along the edges there. So that you hand stitch, and then this one, this actual pocket, um, like the welt of the pocket, you can also pull through. And if this was longer, this could now form your pocket bag. And then you would stitch this pocket bag to that pocket bag. But the important thing now is just to iron this seam open. So there's the garment, and my welt I've stitched up already. So I don't have to worry too much about that. I just have to make sure that this seam is open so that this side is going to be flat. Okay, awesome. So, like I was saying, this portion you probably could just do by machine. I just find it very finicky, so I'm going to do it by hand. I'm not going to stitch right in the corner there because the seam allowance there is very small, so I'm just going to be wasting my time. So I'm starting maybe 2/3, 3/4 down this little opening there. I'm just going to do a whip stitch around the edge there. Like so. And along this top edge, I'm just going to do a prick stitch. So I suppose if you really didn't want to do this by hand, I don't think you really have to at all. You don't have to stitch anything here. You can just leave it exactly as is. I am just extra. Or you could stitch that top portion by machine and then leave those side corners. I don't think there's any real crime in that. I see it often on the suits that I alter. People have just left that, yeah, those corners there, especially in the chest pocket that you don't really use that much. But anyway, as we know, I like to be extra, so I'm just going to stitch all of this all the way. And yeah, having that straight line is going to help me to just keep this nice and neat at the back. So then same story, I'm going to do a whip stitch around the edge. I'm not going to go all the way down. I'm going to go maybe 2/3 or 3/4 down this little pocket hole. Then I'll just pass this back. So here I'll just maybe stitch one more time just to secure it. And then I'm going to come along here and just secure all of this seam allowance. Here, again, I'm just being extra. I feel like gravity is going to pull on this and then it's going to flap down, which, I mean, no one is going to die. But I'm just going to stitch that secure with just a whip stitch, keeping my left hand underneath here so that I can make sure I'm not stitching all the way through to the front of my garment. Can I stitch through? No. Okay. And we keep going, just stitching this seam allowance. Nothing too exciting. And I also just don't want the triangle to flap about, so I'm just going to stitch that. And I'm just going to go 3 places, or 3 times in one place to knot off. I don't really need to have an extra knot there. And from there, I'm going to get another knot. So you can see here, this is now the welt of my welt pocket, and there's the back end. And if this had been longer, this can actually be the underside of the pocket, and then you can just sew that to the top part of the pocket if you want, or I'm going to attach it separately. But at the end of the day, whatever you put in here is going to kind of drag this down, and then on the right side, you don't want to see your pocket in just collapsing like that. So we need to isolate that section so that all those heavy things you put in your pocket are not going to cause a drama. So of course iron that seam open Just going to start here in the corner somewhere, and I'm going to stitch really in the ditch. Again, I suppose you could do this by machine, but it would be very finicky. So I'll just do it by hand. And I'm just going to, I see especially with the chest pocket, people don't stitch this down often because you don't use it so much. But you know the story by now. I just love being extra. So I'm just going to go stitching in the ditch. Now in the ditch, there's actually nothing to hold on to. So you need to be catching your stitches or a little bit of the fabric in some way. Otherwise, you're really just stitching in air. And, you know, because you're now going to be putting your hand in and out, this is now the chest pocket, so not so much. But, you know, these other pockets, you're going to be putting your hands in and out, your keys in and out. So these stitches here, you don't want them to be too big so they can get caught on your keys or a ring or anything like that. Your raggedy hand, your raggedy nails. You just want to keep these stitches as small as possible. And yeah, let's just continue. Make the fashion. Of course, the neater the stitching, the more it will just be invisible. So this is just, like I say, to stop the contents of the pocket from warping and distorting this top edge of the welt. Okay. And here I'll just pass that through to the back. Do a little knot here. And tuck in the edge. Okay, so from here, you can go to the back. There's now my pocket. And now, depending on how you cut your shape, you know, this can be a little bit longer, as long as making it actually a pocket bag, or like this. You know, this is a little bit short. I should have cut it longer, but you know, that's just the Benjamin of the past. And of course, the back side is a little bit higher, so I need that same shape on my pocket bag. And I'm just going to stitch that right sides together, and I can check like this that it's more or less matching my top pocket bag. So I'm just going to stitch that. I'm going to try and get a centimeter seam allowance. I don't know if I'll get that. I'll probably get about half a centimeter, which is going to be a little bit on the sketchy side. 1 centimeter is best. But, you know, sometimes these things happen. Because I always just cut according to how much, or like, you know, the best saving of fabric that I can. So I'm going to stitch that, and of course I'll do an understitch there, and that will then become the pocket. So I'm going to do that at this time. So I stitched this pocket bag on. Now this was really my mistake, to make this portion of the pocket, you know, this welt pocket too short. So you know, I stitched the as big seam allowance as I could, and then I did an understitch. And because it's so short, I did this understitch with a zigzag because it has more stability. But usually your pocket wouldn't be starting so high up; it would be a little bit further down. But that's just how it goes. So then there, I just trimmed it down. Usually I do about 15 centimeters for one of these side pockets, and for a chest pocket about 10 centimeters. I really don't think it matters that much, as long as it's not too deep or too shallow. So those are the measurements that work for me. Now I'm just going to go around and stitch this together. I'm going to go from the wrong side here, so I can come like next door to where my pocket starts. I'm going to come right from there. Then the one thing here in the corners, we're of course going to do around on the corner, so that you don't end up with a whole bunch of dust in a corner. And if you have a corner, it creates like a weak spot. So if you go around like that, it's just stronger. And of course, I'm going to do it twice. So I'll just pop to the machine and do that quickly. Awesome. All right, so there you can see that's been stitched twice with a round on the edge. And from there, we're just going to stitch the edges of this pocket down. And you're here for a chest pocket. Usually I'll do that by hand because you don't really use this, so you don't need too much strength there. If I do that, I'll just stitch along here and then do maybe 1 or 2 stitches on the corner here and just secure this portion. But for this case, because we've got these ones here, I'm actually going to just zigzag by machine, just very neatly over the edge there. And one thing you'll see there's a bit of a bubble there, and that's because this is going to shape over the body. So it needs to be able to curve like that without making this portion too tight. So when I do this, I just pin it over a shape so that it's going to give me that shape. And yeah, now I'm just going to go and just zigzag that, and there the pocket will be pocketed. That's how it goes. Fashion, baby.